Justice, give me justice, please pass some justice down to me. If there's one thing this world needs, it's justice, yes, it's justice. Justice, give me justice, please make it swift, make it rain on my enemies. Save a patch of dry land for me, Lady Justice, dear Justice, please.
On Monday, November 23, 2020, the News and Observer ran a front-page story titled, "Verdict Still Out on Changes to Reduce Jail Populations." The article featured the district attorneys of Durham, Wecht, and Orange counties, respectively Satana DeBerry, Lauren Freeman, and Jim Woodall. On Wednesday, November 25, 2020, Mike Nifong supporter and Crystal Mangum advocate Dr. Sidney Harr wrote the three district attorneys each a 3-page letter in which he suggested an obvious and not so novel solution to jail and prison overcrowding: release the innocents. A response from them is not expected, as they have all ignored Dr. Harr for years, prompting Dr. Harr on April 25, 2016 to file a lawsuit against Wake District Attorney Freeman with a complaint of discrimination and dereliction of duty by Wake County officer of the court. The U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of North Carolina granted defendant Freeman's motion to dismiss Harr's complaint, reinforcing a principle that it is legally appropriate and acceptable practice for district attorneys to ignore their constituents. The News and Observer's Sunday, November 29, 2020 issue contains an opinion piece by its editorial board titled, "Changes May Improve NC Justice System." At its crux is the premise that the 2020's COVID-19 pandemic and the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement, sparked by the Minneapolis police murder of African-American George Floyd, could serve to lessen the gratuitous arrest and incarceration of black people on bogus or minor charges, such as probation violations or misdemeanors. The aim being to reduce jail and prison populations with their inherent close confinements that breed the spread of the deadly virus due to lack of social distancing. The editorial mentions how in July 2020, following Black Lives Matter protests, Governor Roy Cooper commissioned the North Carolina Task Force for Racial Equity in Criminal Justice, consisting of police, justice advocates, and elected officials. The group is co-chaired by North Carolina Attorney General Josh Stein and North Carolina Supreme Court Associate Justice Anita Earls. A report on its recommendations is due on the governor's desk December 15th. The op-ed piece also mentions task force member Durham Representative Marcia Morey, a retired Durham District Court judge and former Durham Assistant District Attorney. She serves as chair of the working group on court procedures. All of the task force members and the three district attorneys are aware of Crystal Mangum's innocence and the April 13, 2011 death of her boyfriend Reginald Daye. They all know that Duke University Hospital staff is liable for Mr. Daye's death because of an errant intubation in treating his delirium tremens. They all knew that medical examiner Dr. Clay Nichols' autopsy report of April 14, 2011 was fraudulent with fabricated findings and a false and unsubstantiated conclusion that Daye died secondary to complications of a stab wound by Mangum. All, with a possible exception of Representative Morey and Justice Earls, were aware of the October 25, 2019 report by world-renowned and revered forensic pathologist Dr. Cyril H. Wecht that stated the manner of Daye's death was an accident by Duke University Hospital and not a homicide from the stab wound inflicted by Mangum. The ramification of Dr. Wecht's report is that Crystal Mangum has already spent nearly 9 years in prison for a crime she not only did not commit, but for a crime that was never committed. On May 26, 2020, armed with Dr. Wecht's report, Haar wrote the Secretary of the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services, Dr. Mandy Cohen, requesting that she order a review of Dr. Nichols' autopsy report. She ignored him, as was standard operating procedure for government officials regarding Haar's inquiries into Mangum's case. At the behest of Dr. Haar, Edgecombe County Representative Mr. Shelley Willingham wrote a 2-page letter to Dr. Cohen on September 9, 2020, seeking a review of the Nichols autopsy. Days later, on September 14, 2020, Dr. Cohen replied by email, stating that a review had been done in 2012 and another review was inappropriate. Specifically, she wrote, quote, "In 2014, then Chief Medical Examiner Deb Radich did a complete and thorough review of the autopsy and found the decedent was stabbed and died of his injury," unquote. This statement by Dr. Cohen is an impossibility, as Mr. Daye was recovering from his stab wound and died only after he was electively removed from life support due to his brain death comatose state caused by Duke Hospital staff. Dr. Cohen further misleads by writing, quote, "OCME, Office of the Chief Medical Examiner, has sent formal correspondence to Dr. Haar," unquote. This is incorrect, as Haar received absolutely no correspondence, formal or informal, from Chief Medical Examiner Dr. Michelle Aurelius. Dr. Aurelius, like other government officials, has refused to communicate with Dr. Haar. Dr. Mandy Cohen, Governor Cooper, his Racial Equity Task Force members, and the trio of district attorneys were and are fully aware of the following. 1. Crystal Mangum is innocent in her boyfriend Reginald Daye's death. 2. Medical malpractice with an errant esophageal intubation of Daye by healthcare staff at Duke University Hospital was responsible for Daye's death. 3. The District Attorney's Office and 4 of the state's star witnesses committed material perjury in securing a wrongful second-degree murder conviction against Mangum. And 4. They could allow the manifest injustice against the single black mother of 3 to proceed because the entire media spectrum was complicit in keeping the truths of Mangum's innocence hidden from the general public. Barry Saunders is a popular columnist who wrote for the News and Observer for many years. His satirical takes on social issues, local and regional, with an acerbic bite. In a column titled, "How Do You Sleep at Night?" published days following Mangum's second-degree murder conviction in November 2013, Mr. Saunders' opening paragraph reads, quote, "You all can exhale now. The Crystal menace has been removed and the streets of Durham are once again safe," unquote. Without doubt, Mr. Saunders is convinced of Mangum's guilt in her boyfriend's death. For example, one paragraph reads, quote, She is being deservedly punished for killing Reginald Daye. Reggie is what his family called him. And not, no matter how much her internet antagonists wish otherwise, for her despicable part in the Duke debacle. Clearly, Mr. Saunders' aim is to both lay blame for Mr. Daye's death squarely on Crystal Mangum, while at the same time reinforcing the narrative that she lied about being sexually assaulted at the 2006 beer-guzzling, stripper-ogling Duke Lacrosse Spring Break Bash. Whereas Mr. Saunders claims Mangum is deservedly being punished, Dr. Wecht's assessment reads otherwise, as the manner of death was accidental. Therefore, no crime was even committed. Bottom line is that the purpose of Mr. Saunders' column was to persuade his audience that the Mangum second-degree murder conviction was just, and not retaliation as payback for her role as accuser in the Duke Lacrosse case. Facts of the case and in court demonstrate that the murder case was about the Duke Lacrosse defendants and not Reginald Daye. Although on its editorial board, Mr. Saunders is loath to submit a column for publication that espouses the truths of Crystal Mangum's innocence. Such an admission put before the general public would be an extreme embarrassment to the state, the courts, and media. Convicting and incarcerating a single black mother of 3 for nearly 9 years of a minimum 14 years sentence for a crime that never happened, with responsibility for Mr. Daye's demise being properly attributed to Duke University Hospital. Media types are well aware that the truth would carry too great a downside in Crystal Mangum's case. The most recent example of enabling by the media is its more than a year-long silence on Dr. Wecht's report, of which Dr. Harb began notifying media types on October 31st, 2019. On November 25th, 2019, CBS 17 News anchor Bill Young conducted a 20-minute Skype interview with Dr. Wecht, an interview which the famed physician attorney indicated he hoped would be shown in its entirety. The interview was never aired or released. There would be no media coverage for a full year after the exonerative report's release. To date, only one media outlet covered Crystal Mangum and the report by Dr. Wecht. A little more than 3 months after notification by HAR of Dr. Wecht's report, a podcast was published on November 3, 2020, on women and crime, titled Episode 30, Interview with Crystal Gail Mangum. The hour-long presentation consisted of 30 minutes of an interview of Mangum by criminologist and assistant professor of criminology, Dr. Megan Sachs. The remainder of the interview was a discussion of Mangum's case by Dr. Sachs and her podcast partner, Dr. Amy Schlossberg, also an associate professor in criminology and criminologist.
Next issue, the medical examiner was fired 4 days before Crystal's trial for mishandling evidence in other cases. They let him stay on, Crystal said, if you heard that, to testify in her trial, but he was dismissed after that, and there was actually talk about criminal charges as well. So they let him testify knowing that this would be his last trial before he's out the door. Yes. And even though did the judge know about this? Yeah, he said it was admissible. There was this issue, too. He said it was admissible, but there was an issue. They had flagged, like, what he did wrong in his personnel files, and the judge sealed it, made it available, I guess, to Crystal's lawyer and the prosecutor, but then sealed it and wouldn't make it available to anyone else. So Crystal doesn't even know what the issues were. She tried to get her hands on that report for a while, saying if he, would have been really important to her defense, and definitely to her appeal to know how he mishandled evidence, and that was the accusation, and then he was testifying at trial. So I think at the very least, we have to be skeptical of his findings. I absolutely agree. she was also able to get Cyril Wecht to review the case and prepare his findings, or a report with his findings. Did he do it pro bono, do you know? Because I can't imagine he has a small price tag, because he is the expert of it. He did not do it pro bono. He doesn't have a small price tag at all. Yeah, but nor should he, because he's brilliant. No, for those of you who don't know him, Dr. Wecht is considered one of the nation's, and maybe even beyond that, leading forensic pathologists. In fact, he served as the president of the Academy of Forensic Sciences. He's written numerous books, and he's really just top of the field. He also opined on, like, the JFK assassination findings, for people who might know him from that. Okay, so what did Wecht find? I was really curious. I was provided with the reports, and I read everything. He analyzed the injuries. He had the reports from the Duke Hospital, which is where Mr. Daye was being treated and where he passed away. He analyzed findings from the medical examiner. Was he asked to just speak on the cause of death, not necessarily on self-defense, correct? Correct, okay. Yes, just literally looking at the cause of death. At trial, she was convicted of second-degree murder because the medical examiner, the one who was fired for mishandling evidence, said the cause of death was complications due to a stab wound, which means the stab wound is what triggered the death. Okay, well, here's what Cyril Wecht said. I was like, I'm reserving opinion until I read what someone who's reviewed everything and someone whose opinion, we can rely on. Wecht said that Mr. Daye underwent surgical repair for a small splenic and colon injury. And a few days after the surgery, he experienced delirium tremens, which is alcohol withdrawal delirium. It was well documented that he was an alcoholic he was going through withdrawal. He was going through severe withdrawal. Wecht further went on that in an episode of aspiration that he was having required that he be intubated. But when the hospital staff at Duke Hospital intubated him, they put the tube in the esophagus rather than the trachea. And as a result, Mr. Daye suffered irreversible brain damage. He lost oxygen for a certain amount of time. And even though they corrected it, it was a huge mistake. It was too late. When they corrected it, the oxygen had been lost. He had brain damage. He went on to, I guess, a coma, or, he was still living, but he was no longer able to function. Despite changing the intubation to the trachea, Mr. Daye did not recover, and he died, again, 13 days later after his injuries. Dr. Wecht, his final conclusion, he took the official position that the cause of death was complications related to delirium tremens, including aspiration due to alcohol withdrawal related to chronic alcoholism, and that the manner of death was accident and not homicide, which was vastly different than what the medical examiner said. Just to play devil's advocate, at this point I do believe that Crystal should not have been charged in Mr. Daye's death, but to play devil's advocate, had it not been for the stab wounds, he would have never been away from the alcohol and never suffered the tremors, hence never needed the intubation. I think that's a very fair point. So this is where things get a little tricky. That's also an issue when I'm teaching forensics, that comes up with cause of death. Yeah. Cause of death is what the event that precipitated it, and was there, usually they ask, so was there an unbroken chain of events, or was it broken? So in this case, he actually explained, Wecht explains in his report, this was a broken chain of events because he was recuperating, and he was recuperating nicely. And he would have, but he could have been home drinking had it not been for her stabbing him. Yeah, so I know it seems like he could have been hit by a bus. He could have, but you're absolutely right. He would not have been in the hospital to have been intubated, likely had he not been stabbed by her. However, officially, if you're relying on cause of death and manner of death, and he's declaring it an accident, he's also saying that the hospital is negligent here. Yeah, that's his opinion. That if you had to blame someone, you'd blame the hospital. That's what Wecht is saying.
It should come as no surprise that neither of them believed, following the interview and review of Dr. Wecht's report, that Crystal Mangum should have been found guilty of murder or manslaughter. The News and Observer editorial board is now, and has frequently in the past, opined on problems of racial injustice in the state's justice system. The aspirational conclusion of this editorial reads, quote, "Once the pandemic passes, we hope the criminal justice system can stick with and build on changes that have fostered fairness in the treatment of all who pass through the state's courts, jail, and prisons." Unquote. In truth, it should append, quote, "all that is except Crystal Mangum, the Duke Lacrosse accuser," unquote. The fact is that the News and Observer has never published an opinion piece about the cruel injustice Mangum has suffered in retaliation by the state and the courts. 3 editorial page editors explicitly refusing to broach the controversial subject. And don't expect the December 15th task force report to recommend the immediate release of Crystal Mangum, as that would not align with its sinister and perverted state-sponsored plot to execute Ms. Mangum by lethal infection, a contagion that has already been responsible for at least 6 inmate hospitalizations and multiple outbreaks and lockdowns at the Anson Correctional Institution, where the Duke Lacrosse accuser remains wrongly confined.
Cobwebs from your eyes and buckle your seatbelt. Lace up your shoes, sir, you've got plenty to say. Good intentions never fly, although you mean well. So you pick your battles and you pick your chin up. You dust your shoes off, you're gone nowhere to you. Open the door, 'cause it's a brand new day, and you say, justice, give me justice, please pass some justice down to me. If there's one thing this world needs, it's justice, yes, it's justice. Justice, give me justice, please make it swift, make it rain on my enemies. Save a patch of dry land for me, Lady Justice, dear Justice, please. Life is an uphill, life is an uphill, life is an uphill battle. Life is an uphill, life is an uphill, life is an uphill battle. Sometimes you get to the top and you fall to your knees and you scream, Lady Justice, please. Lady Justice, give me justice, please pass some justice down to me. If there's one thing this world needs, it's justice, yes, it's justice. Give it to me, yes. Justice, give me justice, please make it swift, make it rain on my enemies. Save a patch of dry land for me.